I'm James Russell. I'm a past president of the British Veterinary Association. I'm now based at the School of Veterinary Medicine and Science at University of Nottingham, where I'm an assistant clinical professor teaching in farm animal medicine. I'm delighted to be your chairman today, where we're discussing the launch of two really important reports, which were both released yesterday. The first is the Veterinary Medicines Directorate's release of their antibiotic use and surveillance data for food-producing animals for 2023. So this refers to 2023. It's being launched now in 2024, and it's valid until this time in 2025. So there we are. That's not at all confusing for any of us, but this is a fantastic report, and I've had great joy in having a dig through and seeing what's in there this year. Our second report is the RUMA Targets Task Force report, which summarises the fourth year of progress against antibiotic use targets identified by the UK Livestock Industries Targets Task Force 2. And there's some great highlights in there as well, and I would draw particular attention to the fact that we now have over 1,000 veterinary farm vet champions against our target of 2,800. So we're making progress. We've got a long way to go, but it's great to see that we've hit 4 figures in terms of the vets involved in that as well. And these reports give us an annual update as to how the UK livestock sectors have performed on antibiotic use over 2023, and an insight into the AMR surveillance work. And indeed, Abby Seeger, the Chief Executive of the VMD, has commented how proud she is of the increasingly robust surveillance procedures. And also both the APHA CEO, Jenny Stewart, and our Chief Vet, Christine Middlemiss, have highlighted in their comments about what's been released yesterday the importance of us continuing with this really important work. So that's our press releases. I'd like to introduce our presenters today. So we have 3 people with us today. We have Kitty Healey, who is the head of the Surveillance Division and the head of AMR at the Veterinary Medicines Directorate. We have Tamsin Dew, the head of AMR and Surveillance at the VMD, and we have Cat McLaughlin, chair of RUMA Agriculture. I'm delighted that we've got those three with us this morning. They really are absolute Goliaths in their field in terms of their knowledge and their ability to speak about these subjects. I do know that sitting in the wings as well, we have others from their teams. And if those people do come in to comment on questions later, I'll make sure that I introduce them as well. We will have opportunity for those questions later on, and we've tried to allow plenty of time today for us to take those questions. Before we get started, though, I'd just like to take a moment and thank everybody for their contributions to the development of both of the reports that we're presenting today. Collating all of this information and cohesively presenting it is no small job, and it's involved many, many stakeholders from across all sectors and industries, as well as the VMD and RUMA. It's taken a lot of hard work, a lot of time, and a lot of effort. I can't go any further without a Blackadder quote, because it feels to me that announcement of where we're up to there requires Lieutenant George and his comment that, you know, if that isn't exciting, then cover me in eggs and flour and bake me for 14 minutes. I think it's exactly how excited I am about where we're at this morning. A couple of housekeeping points. To help the session run smoothly today, just a few practical elements. So please mute yourselves during the webinar. It's entirely up to you whether your camera on or camera off, but please stay muted. We're running this session on Teams, and both of our presenters will shortly share their screens to deliver their report updates. If you've got any questions, please pop them into the Q&A that you'll see at the top of your screen today. As chair, I will then help to coordinate those questions after the speakers have delivered during our Q&A session, to make sure that we don't interrupt the flow of the presentations. We won't do those during presentations, we'll do them afterwards. And of course, you know, we would love to be able to spend the rest of our natural existence doing this, but we will need to come to an end at some point, so I apologise if we don't get to your question. One other question, a housekeeping point, please turn off any sort of AI recording bot that you have this morning. I know that these exist and they often start just automatically when you join a Teams meeting. So if you've got that set up on your Teams, please turn it off. Otherwise, we've got Stana and Dave in the wings who are now AI bot bouncers for us this morning, and we'll be removing any that remain in. For any questions that don't get answered and you still have after the webinar is finished, please contact the comms team either at VMD or RUMA. I'm sure your invite will have come through one of those organisations, so you can either email them directly or Sana will put an email address into the chat towards the end of this session. We will send copies of the reports to you after today's briefing, and those will come through your email that you've registered for the session with. We are recording today, and we will notify you of how to access that recording at a later date. So I think that's enough introduction for me. I'm going to hand over, please, to Kitty and ask her to share her screen and to share with us her presentation from the VMD this morning. Thank you, Kitty.
Thank you very much, James. And I should be sharing my presentation in presenting mode. Is it showing
Absolutely
up for you?
perfect, Kitty. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, James, for that intro, which I will do my best to live up to. And thank you all for coming along. And I hope that you are as excited about this as James is, and indeed I am too. I have the great pleasure of presenting to you the UK VARSS report 2023, published yesterday and reflecting results from 2023. I have a lot of information that I'm going to be talking through. I will do my best to keep to time. I almost certainly won't, but I will do my very best. And well, let's get started. So the first part, the report is split up into 4 chapters, as I'm sure you all know, having read it already. And I'm going to start with the first 2 chapters, which is the sales and usage. So one of the headline figures that we have is the total UK sales of veterinary antibiotics, and this is what we're looking at here. And we can see the trend that we've got since 2014, which is our baseline year. And you will see from the right-hand end of this graph that we've got no change since last year. So we're looking at even to one decimal place, we've got 25.7 milligrams per kilogram in 2023, which is the same as 2022. It's something like a 0.007% increase from 2022. So what we've done is maintained the 59% decrease that we've that we measure from the baseline year in 2014. If you look at the line along the bottom, then you're looking at the tons, which is our measure which isn't corrected for the animal population size in the UK. And so that one is the same kind of trend, but it's a slightly different line because it goes up and down a little bit with the total weight of the animal population in the UK. But we're still seeing 58% decrease since 2014 in that total tonnage. The next thing that I would like to share with you is the sales of what we call highest priority critically important antibiotics. And what we mean by that is antibiotics which are present in veterinary medicines, but which are also of particular importance to human health when they're present in human medicines, and where our use in animals can have consequences for effectiveness of antibiotics in human health. So these are antibiotics that we take particular care with, and you can really see that if you remember the headline sales figure was at 25.7 milligrams per kilogram, so corrected for population size. When you're looking at the total highest priority critically important antibiotics, which I will refer to from now on as HPCIAs, you can see that the total usage of these antibiotics is 0.11 milligrams per kilogram. So This is a reduction overall now of 84% since 2014, and makes up less than 0.5% of the total antibiotic sales in food-producing animals. The individual classes, you can see there the fluoroquinolones, third and fourth generation cephalosporins, and colistin. And you'll also note there on that bottom line that colistin, colistin isn't banned in the UK, but there hasn't been any colistin sold for use in animals for the 4th year in a row. So that is just to be clear on that what I'm saying there is that is a stewardship decision that has been made by vets who prescribe colistin, or have the ability to prescribe colistin but have opted not to. So I've got a couple of quite busy slides here. You'll recognise a lot of the things that I'm showing you here if you look at the VARSS highlights report, incidentally, which is on the gov.uk page and breaks down the full report into infographics and hopefully slightly more digestible chunks. So what we've got here is the first of 2 slides where I'm now moving on to the use of antibiotics, where we have that data available. We don't have it available for every sector, and we only have it available for food producing species at the moment. So I'm going to start with these 4 sectors here. I'll hop around slightly because some of the sectors are split over the 2 slides. But starting with pigs. Now, pigs have long been I think always been the sector that has used the most antibiotics. What you can see here is on I don't think my cursor will work for you, but so I'll try and describe it in words. You can see on the slide you've got the sectors across the left-hand side, and then you've got boxes with little dots in, and each dot represents a ton of antibiotic active substance that's used in that sector. Those little dots again are not corrected for population size, and so to do that for most of the sectors you need to move on to the second box along where it is corrected for population size. So that's where you see that in the pig sector 84.8 milligrams per kilogram of antibiotics corrected for population size were used in 2023. I'd like you to look next at the trend line on the right-hand side. So you can see there that in the slightly longer term, this is at the right-hand end of a steeply decreasing trend of usage in pigs. But that said, it is a bit of an uptick from last year. So we've seen a 13 milligrams per kilogram increase in usage in the pig sector in 2023 compared with 2022, which is an 18% increase. That's against, as I say, a 69% decrease back from 2015, which is when we started getting usage data from the pig sector. In-feed administration is still the most common route of administration in the pig sector, although they are working hard to encourage more targeted in-water administration. And certainly over the years, in-feed administration has dropped from 78% to 51% of pig antibiotic use, but it didn't change between 2022 and 2023. Moving on to the next line then, so we're looking at broilers from the meat poultry sector where antibiotic use is holding relatively steady. This is also the case for turkeys and ducks, which we'll come on to in the next slide. There's a small decrease that we saw in the broiler sector, but as again, if you have a look at the trend line on the right-hand side, you can see that we had some really big decreases a number of years ago, and they are largely holding steady, going up, a little bit down, but largely holding steady. Moving then to the game bird sector. Now, the game bird sector, we have very high coverage for, so this is why we publish the usage data up here, because we know that we have the majority of the game bird sector, but we do not yet calculate the game birds data adjusted for population size. So I'd just like you to note that the 9.9 figure that you've got there isn't a mixed pig figure, it's a tonnage figure, so it's not comparable with the others. And we do know also that this sector uses a relatively high tonnage for the size of the population, and you can see that reflected, if you like, if I draw your attention back to the dots, which are the tons, where it's not that far behind what's used in the broiler sector. There has been, again, if you look at the trend line on the right, there has been a notable increase in the tonnage used since last year. So that's a 40% uptick. Now, some of that is explained by an increase in the game bird population, but not all of it, because the uptick is 47%. The game bird population size increase is around about a third. So there's an increase in overall relative use. So this takes us back to, again, if you look at the trend line, it's around about the same as it was in 2019. But again, looking at the longer term, we're still seeing a net improvement of a 51% reduction in tonnes in this sector since 2016. Then on the last line here, we've got the salmon sector, where you can see there's been quite a bumpy trend over the longer term, but has settled back at 19.9 milligrams per kilogram, which is very nearly the same as it was last year, 1.4 milligrams per kilogram increase since last year. So the salmon sector is back down to where it has been in recent times. So I'll move on then to the second slide on the usage of antibiotics. So I mentioned, I think turkeys are remaining at a similar level to where they were. Again, I refer you to the trend line on the right hand side, where we're seeing a very steady trend, and then moving on to the laying hens, where this sector is maintaining their decreasing trends. I'm going to draw your attention again to the fact that this is not a milligrams per kilogram metric that we're looking at here in the laying hens. So the metric itself is not comparable to the megs per kg figures. It's a percentage bird days metric, which in the way that I understand it is the number of days where antibiotic treatment was actually given to the birds for every 100 days of the bird's life where it could have been given. So that's how that's calculated, and the reasons for this is because of the different nature of the cycles in the animals in this sector. Too technical. If you want more information on this, please do go and dig into the VARSS report proper and its appendices. So then returning to the fish sectors, you can look at trout, and you can see. I don't know if you've picked up on the trend here that we've ordered these in terms of in order of total antibiotic tonnage, and you're getting to the point where you can hardly see the tonnage in that box full of dots. We're getting to partial dots in the trout sector. If you look at the trend line again, you can see there was a spike in usage in 2022, which drew a bit of attention. That was caused by an outbreak of Aeromonas salmonicider in a number of production sites, but you can see that the usage has gone back down to the same ballpark that it's been in recent years. So that is encouraging. And then to finish on this slide with ducks, where if I can phrase this, it's increased by a very small amount, from a very small amount to a marginally higher very small amount. So there is very little use in the duck sector. So I'm going to move to touch now on the usage of highest priority critically important HPCIA antibiotics, which I mentioned earlier in the context of sales. So we've got a different order of sectors here. The layout of the slide is similar to the ones we've been looking at just now, but I would draw your attention to the fact that the little circles are now kilograms, they're not tons. So you can see here on the trend lines, you can see that in the game bird sector, greatest numbers of HPCIAs used in the game bird sector, followed by trout, pigs and meat poultry. In the game bird sector, we've seen a 19% increase. Same comments that I made in the total use supply here in terms of metrics to the game birds, where we're looking at uncorrected for population size increases for this sector. And in fact, in the HPCIAs, although you can see that the usage is relatively high in tons compared with the other sectors, in fact, in the game bird sector itself, the relative use decreased when you take into account the population size. And what we're looking at here in terms of antibiotic is N-rofloxacin, which is the only HPCIA used in this sector. And we've seen a 57% decrease in HPCIA use in game birds since 2016. In trout, now the only HPCIA used in trout is the quinolone oxalinic acid, and its use has decreased. It went from 2 mg per kg in 2022 to 1.8 mg per kg in 2023. So we're looking at a decreasing trend there. Then moving down to pigs, you can see that, again, despite their overall relatively high use in terms of tonnage in total use, they actually are low users of HPCIAs, and you can see that again, the trend line came down with a bump in the early years and has stayed low and gone down ever so slightly lower. And then in meat poultry, just to finish, similarly came down with a bump and has stayed very low. And I think that there's an upward pointing arrow there, but you can see that we're talking about, you know, fractions of a mg per kg. So essentially the same. So I'll move on now and try and speed up a little bit. Those were dense slides, so I'll move on to ruminant data. Now, you'll notice, I expect, the absence of cattle and sheep from the usage slides, and this is because we don't have coverage in these sectors. That means that we can draw conclusions that are representative of the whole country. We've got the sectors I've just been talking about. We've got 85% plus coverage of the population when we're talking about usage, whereas in here we have data on usage from dairy cattle and sheep in the VARSS report, and you can see there with the coverage that we've got 30% coverage for UK dairy cattle and 11% coverage for UK sheep production, and there is a ruminant hub. There's the medicines hub, which has been developed by the sector and launched by AHDB, and there's been an awful lot of work, loads of hard work. There is lots of people trying really hard in the sector. The challenges in the different sectors are different with each sector, and so this is something that we are hugely supportive of. We really value the data that's coming in, but at the moment, unfortunately, the reality is that it's not possible to make inferences across the whole of the UK until we have greater coverage. What we do have, however, in the cattle sector in terms of usage or sales data is information on intramammary products, and so we have this from our sales data. So this is actually the same data set that I was talking about in the first couple of slides of the presentation, and here you can see the trends for intramammary products for lactating cow tubes in the blue and for dry cow tubes in the red, and you can see an overall decreasing trend here, although slight upticks in the last year. Yeah, I think let's leave that there for this slide. And I mentioned 2 slides ago about coverage. This slide is to illustrate the different sectors and the percentage coverage, in other words, the percentage of the animal population where we have information on usage data, and how long we've had that for. You can't see the years, but you can see that there's one little bar per year, and you can see that there are some sectors where we've had high coverage for a long time, and you can see illustrated what I was talking about with the ruminant sectors, where it's proving much harder to get that data, but the will is there and the energy is there, and we will carry on working to get that information. Okay, so turning then briefly to companion animals, so looking here at cats and dogs, and a little bit of a busy slide. I just have a couple of key messages for this slide. Firstly, just to give you an idea of what it is that you're looking at. So this isn't usage data. We've put it in the usage data section because this is where we look at the sector by sector trends, but in fact we've got this data by looking at the sales data that we have at the VMD and doing a process called stratification, which means that we're making assumptions about how much of which product is going into to which species. So there are some assumptions behind this. It's not quite as accurate, but it's good enough for the purposes that we have here. And the key messages here is that in dogs, the overall reduction in total usage is good. In cats, it's a flatter trend. You can see that on the left-hand side. But then the second important message here, we know that there is what's the word I can use? Uncharacteristically for across all the different sectors and species, there's significantly high use of HPCIAs in cats because of the challenges in medicating cats and the treatment options available. But it doesn't mean that HPCIAs are without risk. It just means that the challenges are different. And so we've got a positive sign here that green line on the right-hand side shows that HPCIA use in cats is reducing. From a high baseline, it's still relatively high, but it's the trend is in the right direction, which is thanks to the significant efforts of the vets and the groups in the companion animal sector. Okay, so that was sales and usage, and we're going to move on now to the AMR, to the resistance part of the VARSS report. So I'm going to start with the harmonised monitoring. And the harmonised monitoring is the title that we give for the programme, which is designed to be representative of the UK situation. It looks at healthy animals. It's samples taken at abattoirs, so this is just before these animals enter the food chain. We look at commensal bacteria and we look at zoonotic bacteria, and we've been doing this now for 10 years, and we've been alternating between pig years and poultry years, and 2023 was a pig year, so the results from the full harmonised monitoring programme this year we're showing you are from pigs. But this year we have also we're delighted to share some results that we have from some pilot programs where we have used the same approach, which I'll tell you about a little bit more on the next slide. But where we've had the opportunity to expand this to the beef, dairy, and sheep sectors. So this slide shows you the different sectors that we're looking at, and on the left hand side here is the pigs with full UK coverage, full harmonised monitoring programme. And then on the right hand side you can see each of the other sectors and the coverage. And what you can see, so what we're looking at is taking the same approach, so trying to get baseline data for these. We've got trend data for the pigs, and we've got baseline data from this year with the other sectors. But although it's taking the same approach and mirrors the methodology, the quality of data is not quite to the extent as the same extent as the pig data, because it doesn't cover a full calendar year, and the coverage, I talk a lot about coverage this morning, the coverage is lower, and you can see the percentages there on the maps show you the level of coverage, where it's 81% for pigs, and then it's down 27-28% for the others. So so this is incredibly important baseline data. It's very exciting to start having AMR data from these new species, but it is not yet at the place where the pig sector data is, and the poultry data for the other years. So what are we doing in terms of results? Well, harmonised monitoring. So here I'm just going to be talking about the pig and poultry data. So this is where we take the data over the last 10 years from the pigs and poultry and put them together to make our key indicators, which is how we judge how well we're doing on AMR. And you can see that let me talk you through this. So the multi-drug resistance, so what we don't want to be seeing is that darker line, which is going from higher at the left-hand side to lower on the right-hand side. So that's the direction we want it to be going in. And then the grey line, which is fully susceptible. So any of the antibiotics tested on the panel would have were effective against the indicator E. coli bugs that we were looking at from these animals, and you can see that that's gone from relatively low on the left hand side to relatively high on the right hand side. So all of this is a really positive picture, and something here that I think we can be proud of. So this, to remind you, is pigs and poultry. This doesn't reflect any other sectors. Again, when we take some of these and look at them specifically with the pig sector, so we're looking at the same information as we were looking at in the slide I've just shown you. But if we now look at the slide on, this slide on the left-hand side, that's showing you the full susceptibility and the multi-drug resistance. So the two lines on the slide I just showed you on that left-hand graph, just for pigs only. And then on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see the same bars, but this time looking at full susceptibility and multi-drug resistance for Salmonella species. Why have we only got 2 bars on the right where we've got 5 on the left? Well, that's because the methodology in previous years for collecting Salmonella was changed because it was previously not getting enough actual bugs to test properly, and so we've started from a different baseline. So there's no secret reason behind why we've got 2 years, but we've just got a more recent baseline on that. But again, if you can't call the trend in 2 years, but we're still seeing a similar appearance in terms of full susceptibility increasing, multi-drug resistance decreasing in those Salmonella. What else are we doing with a harmonised monitoring programme? Well, we are also working to expand it. So the harmonised monitoring programme is incredibly useful for actually seeing what's happening to AMR in a way that we can rely on and be able to compare year on year. So we've added in some Enterococcus species, which are an indicator for gram-positive bacteria, in the same way that we've used E. coli as an indicator for gram-negative bacteria. We're looking for resistances in particular that are relevant for human health, so vancomycin resistance, linezolid resistance, and various other things. Very happily, we didn't see any VRE, vancomycin resistance. We have seen some linezolid resistance, and this forms a baseline, so we'll be able to monitor this from here on. Importantly, with these two, we know that these findings are not driven by the use of these antibiotics in animals, because we don't use these antibiotics in animals. So when we're talking about where things like the linezolid resistance may have come from, difficult to answer, but not attributable directly to use of these antibiotics in animals. So it's an important point to bring in the One Health approach, look at transmission routes, and also understand how prescribing of veterinary antibiotics may or may not promote development of these populations in animals. So it's a complex picture, but it's important to be aware of, so that we can help this to inform responsible stewardship messaging and prescribing guidelines. And then Campylobacter coli has been added in. This is so that we have a measure of Campi here, and Campi coli is the most prevalent pig Campylobacter species. We also use selective media to detect certain types of resistance where we're really looking hard to see if there are any of these resistances of concern. So looking at resistance to carbapenems, to colistin, to amikacin, and this. I'll talk a little bit more about selective media, but essentially this is where we are looking at the presence of any resistance to these, and by wiping out all of the susceptible ones. So this doesn't mean that these are being carried in large numbers, but it means that they are present. So we need to be careful not to increase the populations of resistant bugs. Moving on then to include some of the results from the PathSafe project, so the beef, dairy, and sheep sectors. What we're looking at here is fully susceptible E. coli. So this is what we want to see, and we see from here that we're actually seeing very high levels of fully susceptible E. coli from these new sectors that we've brought in the PathSafe. In the PathSafe pilot studies, bearing in mind as well that the slides earlier where I was showing you how we're seeing increasing full susceptibility in pigs and poultry as well. And then when we apply selective media to these same E. coli, so in other words, when we wipe out all of these fully susceptible E. coli and look for what's left in terms of resistance, then this is what you see. A very small, very low numbers. You can see that there are lurking underneath, there are some resistant E. coli, ESBL or AMP-C producing E. coli. And so what this tells us is that we need to be really on our guard. We can't just look at the full susceptibility and say, yes, that's brilliant, look how well we're doing. We can say that, absolutely, but we also need to say this can be masking things that are hiding underneath at low levels, where if we don't keep up our efforts to manage responsible stewardship of antibiotics, then we could inadvertently select for these bugs, and they might start to appear in increasing quantities. Okay, and so I'll lastly turn to the clinical surveillance, and I've just got a couple of slides here to remind you, clinical surveillance, unlike the harmonised monitoring, the clinical surveillance is a programme of passive surveillance. It's not designed to be representative. It's also it's important in that it is looking at bugs that come from animals that quite often are unhealthy. They're being sampled in order to get to the bottom of an illness or a disease outbreak. So maybe more likely to have been treated with antibiotics more recently. But after all of those caveats, and after all of the ways in which it isn't easy to draw conclusions from the clinical surveillance, there's a couple of slides here to illustrate that actually the trends that we're seeing in the harmonised monitoring of overall decreasing resistance in E. coli, when we look at the E. coli that we've seen across all species of animals in the clinical surveillance, we're also seeing here reducing resistance, and you can see that. So each of these little bars, the dark red is from longer ago, and the lighter sort of pink is more recent. So you're seeing a reducing resistance here. And then if we look at salmonella, so the previous one was E. coli, if you look at salmonella, and this time we're looking at full susceptibility, where we want to see increasing trends, indeed you do see on the whole increasing trends for full susceptibility, with one exception right at that right hand end, which is feed, which doesn't necessarily come from the UK, and we can't necessarily influence this directly with our antibiotic stewardship measures. So I'm going to finish up with this slide, because this is the one that nicely draws together the trend line for antibiotic sales, which is that blue line, which starts higher and goes lower, and the indicator for multi-drug resistance, which is the purple bars. And you can see there that as one goes down, as the antibiotic sales go down, the multi-drug resistance follows. And it's a very nice depiction, and something, as I say, something that we, all of us involved with this, should be very proud of, that the vets prescribing these antibiotics should be very proud of, and the farmers who are implementing measures to help reduce the need for antibiotics should be very proud of. It comes with a cautionary tale, because it does come with the tale that if the usage starts to go up, then perhaps the resistance line will start to follow. But let's look at this and take that important message that the two are linked, and that we've been doing a great job so far. So that is it from me, and thank you very much for your attention.
Kitty, thank you very much. There's some really complex slides there, but presented beautifully, articulately and clearly. There was one acronym in there, Kitty, which I just wonder whether we could define. I'm sure everyone on this webinar will know it, but it was thinking about our small animal prescribing, and it was the DDD acronym. I just wonder, before we move on, whether you could just explain that one for us.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, I was wondering which acronym I picked up on. Yes, thank you. That's defined daily dose. It's a measure which is actually a little bit similar. I think Fraser will be here later on to field questions, and he will be able to give you a much more technically accurate answer. But it's a little bit similar to the one that I was talking about with the laying hens, where it takes into account the time, the actual the time treated and the time available to be treated. And so it can be, it's often used where you get artifacts where you're doing a very simple milligrams per kilogram. For example, it's much better where you've got things like long-acting drugs or that sort of thing. It takes that into account.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for defining that. And I'll allow you out of the hot seat to go and relax while Cat presents to us now. But I know you'll be back for questions later. And if you're watching this and you've got questions for Kitty or for Cat, then please do pitch them in to Q&A. I can see in the background we've got some questions coming in already, but we will have plenty of time to talk those through later on. So please do keep pitching them in. From my point of view, I think it's just great to see where we're at in terms of salmon and trout coming back into what might look more like a sustainable trend and an increase in that ruminant coverage, but there may well be other bits that people want to talk through. So thank you ever so much for that, Kitty. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn our attention over to Cat's presentation. As I said earlier, Cat's with us today as chair of RUMA Agriculture and is going to talk to us about Targets Task Force 2. So thank you ever so much, Cat.
Thanks, James. Can I just confirm that you're seeing that in present mode now?
Certainly am. Thank you.
Excellent. So yes, thank you, everyone. Can I just extend my thanks to all that have been involved in pulling this webinar and the information that we're presenting together. It's been a massive effort. So the latest RUMA Targets Task Force report published today summarises the 4th year of progress against the current cycle of targets across all UK livestock sectors for data collection, use of antibiotics, uptake of preventative measures such as vaccines and training, and the development of industry initiatives. We're nearly at the end of this current cycle of targets, which have continued to build on the successful implementation of the first set of targets released back in 2017, which helped to halve sales of antibiotics to treat UK farm animals. And as we are seeing from the latest VARSS report, overall sales have reduced now by nearly 60% since 2014, and resistance is also reducing. And that in itself is testament to the ongoing work and commitment of UK livestock sectors who have achieved these results through continued voluntary efforts and collaboration. As we've heard from Kitty, national usage figures remain low and largely unchanged from last year. And the long-term AMR surveillance work carried out by the Veterinary Medicines Directorate shows multi-drug resistance in animals is at its lowest level in a decade. And this is something that the UK agriculture should be very proud of. I'm certainly very proud of the sectors and efforts I've seen. What we know from both the TTF report and VARSS is that 2013 was yet another year of great effort and commitment from across UK livestock sectors in the responsible use of antibiotics. Whilst there is broadly a positive story to report back on, as we have heard, there are some increases in usage in some sectors, which have been the result of disease outbreaks, lack of availability of key vaccines, environmental impacts, and in some cases, a combination of all three. There is also a reality that we are facing into, that for some sectors, reductions in use have been significant over the past decade, and there will be a point where a plateau in reduction levels is to be expected. I make no apology for stating that again. Antibiotics remain a critical tool in a vet's medicine cabinet, and even with the best husbandry standards, animals can fall ill due to disease outbreaks or as a result of environmental impacts, which can mean antibiotics are necessary at times to treat animals and prevent unnecessary suffering. There will always be challenges, but this has not deterred commitment to the TTF targets. And the sectors we represent at RUMA Agriculture have a strength, determination and resilience that we should all be incredibly proud of. A resilience that is reflected in the continued efforts and achievements which are summarised in our latest TTF report. A handful of sectors, in response to specific disease outbreaks or other factors, have seen some increases in usage in order to effectively address these challenges and protect animal welfare. This reinforces the point that antibiotics are a vital tool to ensure healthy animals and high welfare standards, and the focus is not on zero use, but responsible use. All sectors continue to strive to keep antibiotics effective and fit for purpose and only used when necessary. Of particular note again in this year's report is the inclusion of some further Medicine Hub data, which give an indication of antibiotic use in ruminants. It is important to note that the ruminant sector is incredibly complex compared to other sectors, and designing a centralised hub to start collating data has been a significant undertaking. The work that has gone into its development should not be underestimated, and this is just the start of the journey to build an evidence base from which, in a few years' time, benchmarks could be produced if the sectors want them. What we are seeing, however, in this early snapshot of data from Medicine Hub is confidence and reassurance of the low antibiotic use we expected, coupled with low to negligible HPCIA use, a very positive story indeed. As data submission accelerates over the next couple of years, the data will become more robust and could inform future strategies around responsible use. So I'll just now show a couple of slides on some sector overviews. The second collated data set of antibiotic use in the UK cattle and sheep sectors totals 8,685 enterprises across dairy, beef and sheep. These are still early data, but they do give an indication of antibiotic use in ruminants. Medicine Hub drew on data from 2,662 dairy enterprises, representing 34% of UK dairy cows, to calculate a mean usage of 15.5 milligrams per PCU in that sample. This is not, though, a full year of data yet. This is comparable to the MIGs per PCU in the VARSS report, as a number of adult dairy cattle, the denominator, and adjusted live weights in the Medicine Hub are identical. HPCIA use in this dairy sample was also low, at 0.01 MIGs per PCU. Medicine Hub used 3,498 beef enterprises to calculate a mean antibiotic use of 2.7 MIGs per kg. Mean HPCIA use in the beef sample was 0.002 milligrams per kilogram. Medicine Hub has adopted the Cattle Health and Welfare Group, the CHOG methodology, to calculate beef metrics. This uses a denominator based on the overall population of beef cattle, which are at risk across a range of animal categories and standard weights. This is the SBAC methodology adopted by VARSS. The SBAC methodology adopted by VARSS uses only slaughtered beef animals as the denominator in its calculation. Therefore, total antibiotic use is distributed over a smaller number of animals and is more prone to bias, depending on the proportion of beef farm types contributing to the overall data set. Both the MIGs per PCU and MIGs per kilogram metrics published are useful for national trend monitoring, but care does need to be taken not to compare antibiotic use between the different sectors because of the differences in metrics. A total of 2,525 sheep enterprises was submitted at the point of the report going to print. That's equivalent to 13% of UK finished lambs. Mean antibiotic usage in this sample was calculated to be 4.7 mg per kg. Mean usage of HPCIAs in the sample was particularly low at 0.0007 mg per kg. Medicine Hub has adopted the Sheep Health and Welfare Group, the SHAWK methodology, to calculate sheep metrics. This includes topical antibiotics, which are used more widely in sheep production, and also includes flock replacements in the denominator, alongside ewes and finished lambs. The data captured for the ruminant sectors for the whole of 2023 will be updated later in the year. The TTF report provides lots of updates on the dairy, beef and sheep targets, so I hope you do go and have a read. There's a lot of ongoing work around upskilling farmers, vets and students around medicine's best practice. We have various initiatives facilitating farm health planning. There are focused efforts also around endemic disease control and biosecurity. And these bullet points on the slide illustrate just some of the headlines achieved across these ruminant sectors. There's also a lot of commentary and sources of information about vaccines. We reported last year that the sectors were struggling to get hold of some key vaccines. Whilst we've seen some vaccine supplies recovering, the recovery has been slow and is still perilous, and we anticipate that problems in some supply chains will continue into next year. In 2023, the pig sector has continued to promote the responsible use of antimicrobials and the preservation of the health and welfare of the national herd. Therefore, when needed to treat sick animals, antimicrobials are used as little as possible, but as much as necessary, and that remains the mantra for the pig sector. There has been a continued decline in pig numbers nationally in 2023, with a 10% drop year on year, and sow numbers at a low of 337,000. That was June 2023, and an 11% drop in fattening herd population year on year. Overall, 2023 was a better year with respect to the financial impact on the pig sector, with sustained price and some reduction in cost of production. However, despite this, producers remaining in a much contracted sector have felt the pressure of recouping financial losses of previous years, despite improvements in both cost of production and sale price. The sector has faced significant health challenges affecting the national herd. Swine dysentery cases increased, porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome virus breakdowns, and swine influenza. Overall, enteric health has been more unstable with the swine dysentery challenge, and the sector is also starting to see the impact of the zinc oxide ban on some weaned pigs, the full extent of which is not yet fully understood. There have also been challenges regarding vaccine availability. The impact on herd health management and disease prevention has resulted in the need for antimicrobial interventions to preserve the health and welfare of affected herds. In 2023, the Scottish salmon farming sector continued to focus on the responsible use of antibiotics, balancing the need to protect fish health and welfare with a global aim to reduce use. The sector continues to successfully achieve all its targets, with activity against those targets, data collection, and overall antibiotic stewardship driven forward through the Salmon Scotland Prescribing Vets Group. Salmon farmers recorded an overall increase in the volume of antibiotic used compared to 2022, but use remains significantly below the levels recorded in 2020 and 2021. Increases were observed in both the freshwater and marine phases of production. Antibiotic treatments are still limited to a relatively small number of farms each year, with 7.5% of freshwater farms and 9.8% of marine farms undertaking an antibiotic treatment in 2023. Similar to 2022, the sector experienced challenging conditions within the marine environment where salmon are farmed. Increased water temperatures and oceanic changes further afield led to, in particular, significant challenges with blooms of harmful algae and microjellyfish during late summer and autumn. Although antibiotics are not used against such organisms, jellyfish and harmful algal blooms can impact fish health, potentially leading to secondary bacterial infection. In 2023, similar quantities of oxytetracycline and fluorophenocal were used. As with 2021 and 2022, there was no use of oxalinic acid, which is defined as a higher priority antibiotic. Salmon are farmed in the wild lochs around Scotland's coastline. They're sensitive to environmental changes, which can have direct impacts on the fish, but which more often affects the development and proliferation of some of the harmful organisms that can impact fish health and welfare. Alongside these challenges, the sector experienced significant issues with the supply of fluorophenocal, which led to an unavoidable reliance on oxytetracycline, which is administered at a higher dose rate, thus elevating overall use figures. The sector continues to monitor the fish and the farming environment on a daily basis, promptly reacting wherever necessary and possible. No HPCIAs were used, and 100% of fish were vaccinated against key bacterial and viral health challenges, and autogenous vaccines have been developed where appropriate. In trout, usage of antibacterials decreased in 2023 to 6.9 mg per kg. This decrease is very positive news following a disease outbreak in 2022, which saw a rise in antibiotic use to treat the fish, and the sector is now back on track to keeping below 20 mg per kg. The trout sector has a proven track record of reduced usage over the past 6 years, and the industry remains committed to decreasing use overall, and there is no prophylactic usage of antibacterials. The sector is still undergoing changes with a move towards larger fish production. Total tonnage has increased based on fewer but larger fish. Through the production cycle, this means that farms buy fewer fry to grow on, stocking densities are then lower, and fewer problems were seen. The extreme weather conditions, though, remain a concern and can cause higher water temperatures, which at times can prove challenging for some farms. So this sector is looking at ways of mitigating issues caused by extreme weather. The game bird sector has seen an uplift in usage during 2023, 9.9 tonnes, that's a 47% increase versus 6.4 tonnes in 2022. This increase was largely offset by a significant increase in the number of birds reared, with some data suggesting numbers were higher than pre-COVID and AI. In addition, one consequence of the 2022 AI-related shortage was a significant increase in the value of game birds. This resulted in a far more conservative approach to disease management, which combined with poor weather during the releasing season, increased the amount of antibiotic used per bird. HPCIAs in 2023, we had a 19% increase on 2022. This represents a reduced proportion of overall antibiotic used and is a smaller increase than in the number of birds reared compared to 2022. So it still equates to a 57% reduction since 2016. The weather is having an increasing impact on antibiotic use. The sector is more vulnerable to the effects of weather than any other sector, and this is equally true during the rearing cycle at the time of release. As the effects of climate change appear to create more extreme weather patterns, there is a distinct correlation with weather patterns and the effect on antibiotic use in the game bird sector, whether it be due to wet weather affecting egg cleanliness, hot weather leading to heat stress, damp weather creating problems with hexameta and coccidiosis, or cold windy weather making it difficult to maintain uniform temperatures in brooder huts. All of these factors contribute to increasing the need for medical intervention. The antibiotic use data for the laying hen sector from members of the British Egg Industry Council Lion Scheme for 2023 shows a further reduction from 2022 by another 6.8% to 0.219% bird days treated, which continues to be below the target of 1% bird days. And for the 7th year running, no HPCIAs were used. This is a significant achievement, especially considering that the national flock expanded by nearly 2 million birds over this time period. The Lion Code of Practice version 8 continues to focus on bird health through good biosecurity and hygiene, as well as feed and water quality and veterinary health plans. Training for all staff via the Lion Training Passport within version 8 of the Lion Scheme is mandatory, and the training modules encourage prudent use of antibiotics. All Lion accredited breeders, pullet rearers and laying farms have to be registered with a vet and have an up-to-date flock-specific or annual veterinary health and welfare plan. The industry is continuing the trend towards cage-free production, and there's also been a steady increase in the prevalence of white birds, which have different characteristics and management requirements to brown that can be reflected in lower antimicrobial use. The sector is confident that it will continue to remain below its ongoing antibiotic use target of 1% bird days and 0.05% bird days for HPCIAs. The sector has maintained robust vaccination programs and good biosecurity, with ongoing cooperation and understanding amongst vets and farmers that antibiotic use is generally a last resort. British poultry is half the meat the nation eats, and British Poultry Council businesses are proud to play a vital role in feeding people safe, affordable, nutritious food that tackles the inequalities that define a changing climate. Part of that role is a responsibility to deliver excellent animal health and welfare, and it is one BPS members take incredibly seriously, with a responsibility to feed the nation and a duty of care to protect bird health and well-being. BPS member businesses have reduced their total antibiotic use by 81% since 2012. BPS members remain below target usage levels. Broiler chickens are at 13.54 mg per PCU, under the 25 mg per PCU sector-specific target, and turkeys are 33.62 mg per PCU, which is under the 50 mg per PCU, which are target, so both down from last year. Overall use of all classes of antibiotics was down, and use of HPCIAs, including the fluoroquinolones, the macrolides, and the polymyxins, has decreased by 98.9% since 2012. These are prescribed as a last resort, only after other treatments have been considered. The BPC antibiotic stewardship is at the core of producers' commitment to progress. It has played a crucial part in driving positive change. Working together in a pre-competitive manner, data is monitored and transparency prioritised to ensure the sustainable and responsible use of antibiotics, safeguarding their efficacy to ensure the sector continue producing food that people trust and value. There have been many industry initiatives that have been developed in recent years, which further demonstrate the industry's commitment to tackling AMR. The TTF report provides an overview of a number of these projects, and in some cases, a selection of accompanying case studies and testimonials that highlight the initiatives, tools, and resources in action. All these initiatives have been generated in the last 10 years and clearly demonstrate the unity and collaboration that is embedded into the industry, in particular, a commitment to data collection, training, and best practice. So basically, as I finish up, I'd just like to again acknowledge the huge commitments that the livestock sectors have made over recent years and that continued commitment. There is still ongoing commitment, and the industry continues to challenge itself and ask questions which continue to drive responsible use of medicines. And again, we come back to the mantra, as little as possible and as much as necessary. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Cat. That's fantastic, and some really good news to share in there, as you've said. And I think it's interesting when you're talking about sort of disease outbreaks over the last year or so. That's been a huge focus, I know, of mine and lots of other vets working in this space, to think about not just what's with us at the moment, but what are the sort of threats around our borders, and a recognition of our need to be ready for that, and thinking about how we might respond to it as and when necessary. I would particularly draw, I think, our attention to the continuing absence of HPCIAs in our laying hen sector as being a particularly good news story. You know, I mean, it was in another millennium, Cat, that I was taught about laying hen medicine. But you know, the rules then were very different in terms of where we were thinking in terms of antimicrobial usage with those animals. So really good to see. Thank you, Kat, for that. And I'd invite Kitty to come and join us back on screen as well, because we've got some brilliant questions that have come in during the time that both of you have been speaking. And I'm going to try and break these up into some sort of chunks, if you like. And I think we've got kind of 5 key themes. So I'm going to put both the questions here that relate to sort of coverage to you, and then ask you both to comment on them as a one-er, really. So question from Philip Sketchley. Is it known what percentage of the respective species animal population numbers are now captured within the medicines hub compared compared to quantity sold and prescribed versus those actually used in those animals. But then to add to that, if I may, Amy Jackson's question, where she's started by complimenting us, so I'll definitely raise this. Tremendous results, congratulations to all. However, despite enormous efforts to develop and populate the medicines hub for many in the industry, we're on track to miss some or all of the 23 and 24 targets. So Amy's question, how much longer do we continue with this kind of voluntary engagement, and at what point do we bite the bullet and sort of force people into recording in this way, as alluded to in the new veterinary medicines regs? So question really on where we're at with encouraging people to record, and a question about percentages as well from Phil. Can I ask you to speak to both of those? And I think we might want to bring Fraser Broadfoot in here as well from the VMD. So Fraser, feel free to come off mute and bring your camera on if you would like to. Kitty, do you want to comment on that first?
Thanks. Yeah. It's great to see all these questions, and great challenging questions. And I think on that note, I think on the first part, on Phil's part, I'd like to bring Fraser in, because he's got a really good knowledge of those facts and figures, and then I'll come back in, if I might, on Amy's point.
Okay, thanks, Kitty. Are you there, Fraser? Can you
Yes,
comment on that?
I'm here. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
We can, thank you.
Great, brilliant. So yeah, just to answer the questions on percentage coverage. So so the data that was published in the VARSS report this year for dairy, comes from the Medicine Hub, which is what the question relates to. So the coverage for dairy this year was 30%, and in the year before it was 32%. So there has been a slight decrease in the coverage published for dairy, whereas for sheep, the coverage relates to the percentage of finished lambs, and that's increased from 9%, a slight increase from 9% to 11%. Now, we didn't publish the beef data in the VARSS report this year, but we did publish it last year, and that was at less than 10% as well. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Fraser. Kitty, then, Amy's question about where we're at with regulation.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think it's a really important question. It's great to have the opportunity to raise it here. When do we bite the bullet? Well, it's not something you can put a timeline on, but what I would say is that we want voluntary engagement has so many benefits to it and so many advantages, because it means that we're all pulling together for the same thing, and it also means that it's within the gift of the people doing the reporting to shape the system into a system that works for them. But I do understand the challenges, that there are huge challenges. There are so many things that need doing, and the sectors, like I mentioned really briefly as an aside in my presentation, the challenges and in all the different sectors are very different. They all look different. What does this mean for biting the bullet? I think what it means is that we continue with a voluntary approach, but the voluntary approach needs to start including increasing engagement on actually bringing the conversation back to the veterinary medicines regulation, the fact that there is the power to require submission of these data, and actually have that conversation, move that into the conversation. Is this actually something which would be beneficial? Would people want it? Would people welcome it? And if so, in what way? I mean, of course, I guess if we get too far down, I don't want to be sitting here saying the same thing in 10 years' time. I mean, in 10 years' time, I'd really hope we've got great coverage across all of the sectors, because we can't do this forever. So there is a limit. But absolutely, we need to make the most of the relationships that we have, and really put our faith in delivering through those, whether that's the voluntary approach or whether that's moving on to conversations around, well, if we were to talk about implementing a more mandatory approach to this, then how would we go about doing that? Again, in conversation.
Thank you. And Cat, obviously you're somebody who wears many different hats, sometimes simultaneously, which I recognise the challenge of. But you've probably got quite a broad view on this, an appetite for regulation. Are you seeing that from an agricultural sector?
Yeah, it's a really challenging question and concept. everything that we've done so far has been done on the back of voluntary initiatives and voluntary commitment. And I think there is still a huge merit in continuing with that voluntary approach. It brings people on the journey. And I think the results we've seen over the years reflects that winning of hearts and minds. I generally feel that when people, and by this I mean farmers and vets, understand the importance of doing something, they're more invested. So they're more likely to step up to the challenge over and over again, rather than doing something for no reason other than they're being told that they've got to do it. That being said, I absolutely recognise that there may well come a time when mandation is necessary to scoop up those last people who maybe haven't engaged yet, or for whatever reason they haven't engaged. And I think that's something that all of the animal keepers that we've talked about and vets will probably accept, because let's face it, nobody wants a continued damage of the reputation of an industry by people who refuse to engage. But I think as well, we also need to be very clear that a mandatory system won't necessarily be an easy option for government or industry to adopt and manage. We've seen, even setting up the Medicine Hub, that's a voluntary initiative, how difficult and complex that process has been. So, I think we need to be very, very clear and very aware that even if the VMD were to start that process in the VMR, which they have the right to do, a mandatory collection system will be really difficult. It will require an awful lot of investment and big data boffins to sit and try and work through how they do that. So it's not going to be a quick and easy fix. So I would much prefer a voluntary system to continue as long as we can, because I feel that would earn the buy-in of keepers and vets, and whilst also winning and retaining the confidence of government.
Thank you. And I wonder how much of what you're alluding to there is what I often describe as the Bakewell market test of if you're somebody who hasn't engaged, hasn't bought into this, whether actually your neighbours and colleagues choose not to sit next to you for breakfast at Bakewell market. And whether that sort of societal change is perhaps part of what we're looking for here as well. Do you think?
I think peer pressure in all sorts of things, not just this, is a huge factor. And I think we've seen that over the last 10 years across all the different sectors. So I think it probably will. I've never heard of it described as a Bakewell market analogy, but I think that's a very good one, Jane.
I'm sticking with it. Kitty, you wanted to come back as well before we move on.
Thank you. Yeah, just if I may, I just thought it might be helpful to kind of wind the clock back, very nearly, probably it's about 10 years actually, and just recall that in fact all of this started from a place when the world looked pretty different, but when actually the initiatives were started because of anticipated mandatory reporting requirements. In that case, in the EU context, but our perspective now is still very much the same in principle around the fact that if we're looking at a mandatory reporting system, or as things then turned out, if we're not necessarily, the point is that it will work best and it will deliver best value to everybody involved in it if it is designed and implemented with the driving force and the intelligence coming from the sectors and the buy-in and all of the things that Cat and I have just been talking about now. But again, just to go back, the original policy intent was engagement to an endpoint of mandatory reporting. So it's kind of full circle that we're talking about that again.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to jump us on because I'm determined to try and do two things. One is to give an airing to as many questions as we can, and the second is to bring us to a close as close to 11:30 as I possibly can do. So I'm going to move on. There's a couple of questions from Shabir in here relating to minimum inhibitory concentrations. One of them I'm going to answer, which is Shabir has asked us about how the UK data compares to European data. And I know that that's something we're going to know much better next year when we expect an updated EFSA report. So I think we'll perhaps hold that question until this time next time, Shabir. But quick sort of technical question. Are the MICs being interpreted using CBPs, which I believe is clinical breakpoints, or ECVs, epidemiologically clinical or something values, and bearing in mind that for enteric bacteria there are very few, if any, CBPs. Tamsin, I can see you've come on camera. Did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, if you're fine with that, Kitty.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shabs, for the question. So that was around whether the MIC results, as you say, clinical breakpoints, James, or using interpreted using epidemiological cutoff values. The answer is the latter. They're interpreted using the ECOFs. Shabs, I know that you know what that means, but for those of you on the call who are not microbiologists, what that means basically is that the results shown and presented in Chapter 3, the harmonised monitoring chapter, do not necessarily mean that those isolates would be clinically resistant to those antibiotics. That's either in animals or in people. We use a more sensitive measure, which is the ECOFs, which aims to detect, I guess, the divergence from what's normal from that bacteria. So we're trying to work out whether those bacteria as a population are becoming more resistant at an earlier stage than when it actually becomes clinically important.
Thanks, Tamsin. Kitty and Cat, I don't want to prolong it, but is there anything either of you wanted to add to what Tamsin's just said to us? Thank you, Tamsin, really helpful. I'll move us on to another theme then, which I think has come through, which is that ultimately all of this work that we're doing, as well as thinking about resistance in animal species, is focused on protecting antimicrobials for human use. So we've got two questions here, one from Josh and one from Shabir again. So I'll bring those both in together. I will do if I can actually find them. So one from Shabir, fantastic to see reductions in antibiotics in veterinary medicine. Human resistance data globally continues to show an alarming upward trend. That being the case, why is there so much focus on veterinary medicine when perhaps we should be focusing on human use? And sort of allied to that, Josh has said, Kitty, I think you said that we're seeing resistance in animals to antibiotics that are not used in animals, and I think that was perhaps the E. coli with colistin. And have I understood this right? And I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about whether we think that's misuse and overuse in people. So can I bring those two in together? And perhaps Kitty, to you first, seeing as that came into your presentation.
Thanks. Yes, and thanks for these questions. I think it's really helpful to explore these a little bit more. Which to start with. So I think, and James, I'll rely on you if I may to remind me of things if I haven't covered all of the elements. I mean, first of all, Shabs, should we be doing all of this? Is it making that much of a difference? So James, when you introduced the questions, you said yourself that one of the reasons that we're doing this is to preserve the effectiveness of antibiotics for use in animals in veterinary patients, because this affects us too, and maybe we're not seeing such a song and dance about it in the media about antibiotics not working in animals, but we know that it happens, and we don't maybe talk about it as much. Maybe we don't see it as much, or maybe it's just that our surveillance isn't focused on looking for it as much, because all the harmonized monitoring stuff we're looking at as you say, Shabs, with a focus on actually what's the effect or the risk or the transmission pathways or the trends that might most be likely to impact people. But yeah, so we have self-interest in maintaining the effectiveness of antibiotics in animals. Does it have an impact in people? Yeah, I mean, it does have an impact in people. It's not a question of does it, it's a question of how much and is it worth it. And I think that you know, in a sense, it's worth it for the first point on maintaining the effectiveness in animals alone. It's also worth it if, you know, if we're expecting people to have confidence in food producing animals and the sectors producing food for human consumption, if we're not taking care to try and minimize the risk of resistant Salmonella, for example, or Campylobacter, which we know can cause foodborne infections, then that feels like we're kind of missing the job description of producing, you know, safe food. So I think that the questions that we need to ask ourselves need to be possibly slightly different. I think then, and Josh was talking about, well, hang on, why are we finding these things that we don't expect to find? And is this coming from, what did you say, James? Responsible, irresponsible, or misuse?
Irresponsible or overuse or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on the responsibleness or otherwise of the use in humans, but ultimately any use of antibiotics will drive resistance, whether that's in people, whether it's in animals, whether it's in the environment, whether it's, you know, in a petri dish or whatever. So yeah, I mean, use of those antibiotics is likely to be driving that resistance, and since we don't use those antibiotics in animals, then it's not going to be use of those animals and in animals that's driving those resistances. So absolutely, I think I mentioned the One Health and transmission pathways in my presentation. I think that that's definitely something which is really important, because if there are resistances coming from people, whether that's directly because people and animals, you know, come into contact, whether it's through routes such as in waterways or other routes like that, if there are things where we have the ability to cut a transmission pathway and therefore stop some of that cycling of resistance and then potentially amplification, then we definitely should be doing that. So One Health messaging, and I think that the final point I'll make on that before handing back to you, James, is in terms of stewardship, we need to look for these things. We need to understand what's happening, where we might need to go, right, we need to just have a look at our prescribing guidelines, see, is there anything that we're using that's a veterinary antibiotic, that's a normal responsible use, that actually could be driving this through cross-resistance or co-selection or something like that, even though the use of that antibiotic hasn't driven it, and the veterinary prescribing hasn't even necessarily been responsible for that bug and that resistance arising in that animal. But once it's there, if we know about it, we can adapt our stewardship so that we minimize the risk of it amplifying. Thanks.
Thanks, Kitty, and great to hear One Health getting a mention there. And if anyone's got any kind of tips for how we might continue to engage people outside of the sort of veterinary and agricultural sector in One Health on a broader measure than this, I think that would be really good to hear as well. But Kat, did you want to add to anything Kitty said?
Yeah, I think for me, I think One Health needs to be put into an important context. So, and there are going to be more able people than me to talk about the science around the kind of links between AMR in humans and what we're doing in agriculture. But the basic premise that I've always worked to is the more you use antibiotics, especially if you use them irresponsibly, the more problems you store up in terms of resistance, efficacy, and effectiveness. So that, in my mind, has always justified the efforts that we're putting into agriculture's responsible use principles. Now, animals and people share many of the antibiotic classes, and it's a well-recognized reality that there aren't too many new antibiotics coming down the pipeline. And if they are, they won't come to the veterinary toolbox for many years. So whilst the grand benefit of what we're doing is to help save human lives and promote the One Health agenda, I think for us in the RUMA world, in the kind of agricultural world, we need to keep our focus on protecting and preserving the antibiotics, that the veterinary antibiotics that we have available, so that we can continue saving animals' lives as well. And I think that's, as I say, it just sometimes needs to be put in context. This is not purely an altruistic issue that we're working on. We want to try and preserve as many veterinary antibiotics as possible so that vets and farmers will continue to have those antibiotics available to them for animal health and welfare. At the minute, we're in a good place. You know, all the VMD surveillance records are showing that we don't have a particular problem with absolute AMR in the veterinary side, and I want to keep us in that position. So that I think needs to be kind of kept front and centre with everything that we're doing.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, just to circle back to where we started earlier, thinking about antibiotic champions, farm vet champions, that sort of message is really important, getting that on farm, isn't it? And I often talk with my students about the potential conflict which exists between the oath that they will take to care for the animals committed to their care versus their sort of moral and ethical obligation to do exactly as you're describing, Cat, and sustain this for the future. So while we're thinking sort of One Health, let's just jump onto the climate, tiny topic. How is climate change and extreme weather predicted to impact antibiotic use, and what work is being done around this? Don't mind who comes in first on that.
Okay, I'll jump in. Right, we saw in the narrative that I was putting to the fish sectors, for instance, the huge sensitivity that the fish sector, for instance, has to climate change. The game birds as well, they are struggling with it. Agriculture and food production and food animal production is having to adapt. It's having to find new ways of dealing with things. We will see new diseases coming down the line with climate change. And all of that means that we have to be quite fleet of foot. Again, it comes back to making sure that we've got all the veterinary medicines that we need at our disposal to react as we all need to. I think the one thing that I will do at this point is bring in why we get so worried about vaccines. Because ultimately, if we know that we're going to start and see more and more challenges based on changing weather conditions and weather patterns, we need to be able to protect our animals from that before they start to get those issues. And that's where vaccines are so important to us. We have seen some of the vaccine shortages. And as I said in my narrative, we're still on quite a precipice with vaccine availability. So the one thing that I would want to see is vaccines coming higher and higher up the government's risk register. We have written to, as RUMA, we've written to VMD, we've written to the CVO, and we've got good engagement. But I think it needs to be recognised as more and more of an issue. Potentially, I think we need a vaccine strategy, the same way that we talk about food strategy and, you know, kind of climate strategies. We need a vaccine strategy as well. And that, in my mind, should also bring in the likes of business and trade departments in government, because that, in my mind, is how we look at some of the investment that is needed into the pharmaceutical markets, and then kind of all of the kind of the supply chains that fall from that. That's where I think we need to be going. I know I've maybe not answered it directly, coming back to climate change, but I think it's all just part of that changing world that food production is now in, and we need to start and look at some of those things that will help us react.
No, thank you for that, and thank you, Jackie, for your question. And just to echo what Cat has said, I think the importance of a national vaccine strategy is something that we're considering at Animal Health and Welfare Board as well. And just on the back of that, you know, I know that there's evidence that warming temperatures in and of themselves can have an impact on antimicrobial resistance, so we should be sort of cognizant of that. But to pick up on another question really around vaccines is, Cat, you mentioned that you've been writing to VMD and others about vaccine availability. Have we got any additional knowledge on where vaccine shortages are arising and whether there's anything else we could be doing about that?
It's just gone straight out of my head at the minute.
Don't worry.
I know. Look, I'm not going to give you any brand names for vaccines, but I know we've had lots of issues across all of the sectors. Sheep sector has been struggling. You know, kind of we know the fish sector has struggled. So there's an awful lot of different ranges of vaccines where we've had issues and availability problems. Sorry, my brain has just gone blank though.
Don't worry. And I think, you know, where we're at is just thinking about the fragility of some of our supply chains, isn't it? And what we can do as a country to be better able to predict need and so on. But look, thank you for that. And thank you both. And the one question that we haven't got to today, and I'm afraid I'm not going to bring it into our conversation because I think we could spend the rest of the day on it, is around breeding for, you know, less antimicrobial requirement, less need for antimicrobial usage over time. I think that's something that we could go into huge depth on over a long period of time, and certainly, you know, is a feature again of what we're thinking with Animal Health and Welfare Pathway in England and reducing endemic diseases in our farmed species. So thank you for the question, Josh. I think we recognise it, and I think it's something that we know will form part of our future strategy. But we are at 11:30, so I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who's been involved today. Our speakers were absolutely superb, both of them, and everyone who's attended and asked questions. I've been looking, and pretty well everyone has remained with us right through all of our questions, which I think is testament to the quality of the responses that we were getting. So both of these important industry reports are demonstrating yet another year of great effort and commitment from across our sectors in the responsible use of antibiotics. National figures remain low, remain largely unchanged, and our long-term AMR surveillance work carried out by the VMD is showing that multi-drug resistance is reducing and at its lowest level for a decade. So we've got a lot to be proud of. We should have confidence to be able to focus on building on what's already been done and be as ambitious as we possibly can be as we drive forward efforts to tackle AMR and protect the efficiency and the efficacy of antibiotics. And all of that is going to have the common goal, as Cat has said to us, of saving the lives of animals, and as we alluded to earlier, of saving the lives of humans as well. And that really should be a great motivation for us to continue in this good work. So once again, thank you to everyone for being here, and we will close there.